I put the lineup in the chat if everyone wants to start pouring the Orkney, and we'll get started. All right, and there's Jeff as well. So let's get started. And Angus, I'll watch for everybody to make sure they come in. So we've got folks here from all over the country, from let's see, Massachusetts to New York to Ohio, Iowa, California, Washington, Texas. So a good and more. I probably can't remember all of them. So we've got a really good mix of whiskey fans, connoisseurs, a couple first or second timers. And we had such a great time about a month ago, maybe more, Angus, that we did the last tasting.
Yeah.
And everyone had a really good time, both with awesome drams, but then learning more about you and Decadent Drinks, Equilibrium and Solstice, and tons of questions. And so everyone was eager to take the chance to have another tasting. And so Angus and I talked, and we thought, why not do something around the new releases? So most of what you will drink today is a new release. And you'll be able to hear a lot about those casks, why they're selected, the bottling, the labels, how those are put together. I think the Van Gogh label is probably the most interesting one. Everyone has a sample kit. There's a QR code on there that'll take you right to the actual bottle on Angus, your website. So you all will be able to see the label and all the other details. I'm sure we'll talk about ABV and cask, but if you want any specific details, just go there. But we welcome all of your thoughts, comments, questions, and welcoming back Angus. So Angus is all things Scotch, whiskey, spirits, and we've enjoyed all the tastings that we've been on with you, Angus. And so if any of you haven't been on a tasting, you're in for a treat, because this is someone that is very much dedicated and passionate about all things whiskey and spirits, but especially Scotch today. And all of these are very special to his heart, and certainly is around that theme of sharing his background, his ideas for where he's going with Decadent Drinks and WhiskySponge. And so, having a US audience, a US based audience here to give him, honest feedback. What do we love? What do we maybe not like as much, but we like to see more of? All those things are welcome here today. So without further ado, Angus, thank you for having us and hosting us again today.
Well, thanks very much, James, and thanks for that intro. And it is really great to be able to do these kind of events, and I'm always humbled by the fact that a bunch of fellow geeks on the other side of the pond show up for them, and it's just very nice to have quite a casual, chilled out chat about our bottlings and about whiskey in general. So this is a range of bottlings, recent ones from Decadent Drinks, some very new, some actually a few months they've been out now, but it's all stuff we bottled relatively recently. And I think it's a very strong lineup tonight. There's a lot of whiskies in there that I'm very, very happy with. In fact, every single one of them I was pretty pleased with when we got them out. So we'll start off with dram number 1, which is Orkney Sponge number 3. And I'll give you a little bit of background about this. So one of the brands that really inspired me for Decadent Drinks is a very old brand called Old Orkney, which was actually associated with Stromness Distillery on Orkney, which closed in 1928, I think. And so it was really one of the first whiskey brands that did fun and playfulness and cheekiness and silliness, and had some quite creative original artwork. So there's quite a lot of synergy between that.
All right, Angus, I think we just lost you. But while he's getting back, I'd like to welcome everyone else that just joined in, Rick and Michael, Chris. I put the lineup in the chat. I'll put it in there a couple more times for any latecomers, as well as there's a discount code that they offered us again. I think there's also a free shipping option over a certain amount, but you'll see it pop in the chat a couple more times as people come in. Hey, Michael. And so, who was on here at the very beginning? Olaf and Richard. Hopefully I didn't jinx it. So Angus was coming in loud and clear for about 10-15 minutes. And I was like, hey, remember, like, you're coming in really loud and clear. You don't need to do anything. Don't change any internet settings. Because last time, if you all remember on this tasting, his internet was going in and out. So I changed it back to Zoom in case that helped. But then as soon as you got started, it just cut again. So, anyways, we poured the Orkney. Feel free to pour that. I know he's here. He is. Um, Go ahead, Angus, if
Yeah,
you're back
hi.
with us.
I'm just trying to.
I think this is a classic. I wrote in the chat. This is a classic Orkney nose. Really nice.
Great. Right. Is that is that better? Can you hear me okay now?
It is, and if it keeps cutting out, I'll send you a note, Angus. Maybe turn off the video, but we can hear you.
No, I think I've switched to a different internet thing now. Anyway, I apologize about that. Old Orkney. So we bought the brand Old Orkney, long story short, and I haven't quite decided what I wanted, whether I want to do something more serious or formal with it yet. But in the meantime, we've been having some fun doing Orkney Sponge, which is a sort of mashup of WhiskySponge and the old Orkney brand. It's taking cues from that that old brand. And the other reason part of this is that I just love Orkney whiskies. Whether it's the lighter side of it with Scapa or the sort of heavier, fuller side of it with Highland Park, which this one is, by the way. This is a 2006 unnamed Highland Park. And I just really love, I think they're charismatic whiskies. I think they speak to a sense of place. I think they're evocative when you stick your nose in a glass and close your eyes. If you've ever been to Orkney, they're whiskies that tend to take you back there. And that to me is always a sign of something special in whiskey. So this is the third bottling we did, and it's 2006 single refill hogshead of Highland Park, bottled with about 3 degrees reduction down to 57.1. And I felt that reduction just rounded it out nicely, brought a bit more of the honeyed side of it. I tend to think of Orkney whiskies as being really about heather honey and a particular profile of peat, which is much softer, much more gentle, much more towards sort of drier herbal qualities. And it's flavor profiles you don't tend to find in peated whiskies from Islay or at the mainland either. So that's the other thing about Highland Park. It makes fantastic distillate, has their own floor maltings, makes very good use of a quite idiosyncratic peat source. It's just a bit odd that the distilleries seem to bottle expressions of their whiskey, which I don't think necessarily express their, the DNA and the power of their spirit quite as well. So this one was really designed to give just a very direct distillery character forward expression of Highland Park, and just to bottling just designed really to celebrate that style, that profile. And I think I don't think it's a hugely complex whiskey. I think it's a whiskey quite dominated by fresh coastal character, that heather honey Orkney malt profile, and a nice gentle underneath sort of thread of peat that runs throughout it. So full-bodied, lots of character, lots of personality, and approachable, simple, direct, easy to drink. That would be the way I would characterize this whiskey. So I hope you're all enjoying it. And yeah.
I think it's that sweet spot of 15 to 20 year unsherried for me, at least for Highland Park. But I think that's what you were alluding to too. There's so much sherry within, and it can be really, really good too, but it does mask some of those other flavors that you get out of this.
Yeah, it is true. Highland Park and sherry can be a bit of a complicated relationship. I mean, when it works, it can be beautiful, but certainly just good, fairly naked refill wood. And if you have charismatic distillate, I don't think you need a lot of wood to bring it out of its shell. And that's very much the case here. It's a really nice age. It's rounded, it's mature, but it's still very fresh. And especially with coastal whiskies like this, where you get quite a evocative coastal profile, that freshness is really important to me. So do people like it? What's the general sort of feeling about this one?
Yeah, we're a small enough group. Yeah, just call it out. Go for it.
I was just going to say this one is, I have gone through about a half bottle of the number 2. This one has more barrel on the finish. It's definitely more herbal. I get the honey, but it's more of a medicinal honey than, say, a straight floral heather honey like the number 2.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the edition 2, which was a 2005 similar profile though, and bottled about 55% rather than 57.1, it was more of, I think, drilling into that really heather honey, slightly sweeter, slightly more cask influence perhaps overall, but yeah, it's always interesting when we get them to do them side by side, because it always seems to divide people whether they prefer the second one or the third one. Just reading comments here. Nice. Yeah, and absolutely water does help this one as well. So with this one, I think that like we reduced it a bit, and that brings a little bit of the the character of reducing whiskey, but then you still leave a whole load more room for people to come in and play around, add more water, and it is a dram that works very well. When we did these casks, the second one and the third one, I was looking at them at multiple range of strengths, and they worked well at most strengths. But I just decided at the end on 57.1 because I felt it's quite a robust dram. I want to preserve a good deal of power in it. So yeah, that's that. I mean, and in terms of the future, we've got a couple more interesting Orkney casks, and I think we'll probably see an Orkney Sponge 4 at some point this year. That's the plan. What exactly we choose for it, I don't know. We'll see. But we've got a couple of nice options.
So as we go, Angus, can you share with us? So two things. One is, can you tell us more about the sponge character? I know it's going to come up, and I know a couple are going to have some questions on it. Where is the inspiration? Where does that come from? What does it mean? This particular label has 100. Was this what is the 100 for here as well?
So yeah, this is really reference to 100 proof. So 57.1 is pretty much my favorite bottling strength, and it's in relation to the old imperial measurement 100 proof, which was, back in say the 70s or 60s, you couldn't really get malt whiskey at cask strength. The equivalent was that some companies that did small agents that would do something approximate to independent bottling, Gordon MacPhail or Cadenheads, or companies like Robert Watson of Aberdeen or Campbell Hope and King. These companies would occasionally offer high strength versions of their whiskies at 100 proof, 57.1%. So those tended to be the closest you could get to trying these really old style whiskies in the most unchanged format possible. And also, I think it's a strength that, because it tends to be just below the cask strength. If something has been bottled at 57.1, it's probably been brought down by only 2 to 3 degrees, really. So you're getting a whiskey which is still retaining maximum power and often freshness, and they last so well in the bottle. These old 100 proof bottles are still, when you open them today, 50 years after being in glass, they're still super fresh and super detailed and really beautiful whiskies. So I love the strength. I think it works well for multiple spirits. I think many good full-bodied characterful whiskies show fantastically that strength. So that's the reason, and we've done that on multiple bottlings now. Loads and loads of sponges are done at 100 proof, and some of them we draw attention to 100 proof. Like we've got a Clynelish, an unnamed Clynelish coming up in May this month, and that's 12-year-old and done at 100 proof as well. And that's where we've played around with that on the label a wee bit as well. So I never tire of doing that, and it's just really the old bottle geek in me that is doing that. So yeah, and then with the rest of the sponge character, really, what to say?
Yeah, we're so curious.
The sponge really was just a tone of voice that I adopted when I was writing it as a blog, and the actual visual manifestation of the character has evolved a little bit since we started doing bottling. I never intended to start doing bottling, so it has been something that is really subject to quite a natural evolution. And we had an original design on the first 3 bottlings. The sponge is a bit square, and I didn't want to get sued by people who make SpongeBob SquarePants. So we adapted the design when I started working with a new artist and made it a bit more unique. And it's just a really like an alter ego of me, if I'm being honest. His tone of voice, his sense of humor, it's all just born from a place of a satirical blog where I adopted this persona or tone of voice in order to say things that I wouldn't ordinarily say as me, and which is kind of a pretty standard thing, textbook move in writing satire. And I've tried to adapt that into like a visual form for the labels. And he's just a silly little character who gets up to all kinds of hijinks and is not subject to the same laws of physics that govern our bodies and like our ability to inability to travel in time or space. The sponge has no problem with that. He can pop up anywhere in the universe, anywhere in history. He can do things like put himself headfirst into a still and pop his head out the other end of the worm tub. He's a very adaptable little guy. So yeah, it's cool.
Well, we had a question from Olaf. Olaf, do you want to pose that?
Sure. I was just curious who you said you bought the old Orkney brand. I was wondering who used to own it.
We bought it from, so it was owned obviously by the distillery Stromness that went into liquidation. I don't know who in the interim years owned it, but by the 1990s, the brand had been acquired by Gordon and MacPhail. Not deliberately, I expect, probably just incidentally. They did Old Orkney blended Scotch whiskey in the 90s, and that was the last time the brand was used in a bottle. And it was quite a sort of plain, simple, sort of typical 90s G&M sort of design. I knew they had this. I knew they hadn't done anything with it for ages. I approached them and said, look, I know you've got this. Would you sell it to us? And they did. And I was just thought, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I have a reasonably good relationship with them. And yeah, they did. So I think later this year, maybe instead of Orkney Sponge 4, what the thing in my head is, do I just do an old Orkney bottle and just use the brand 100%, no sponge component at all? But the thing I'm sort of holding off for is I'd really like to do it with a different bottle. I'd like to have something more individualistic that really physically sets that brand apart and gives it its own identity, because it is deserving of that. If I'm doing sponge and mixing it up, mashing it up, I'm happy just to put it in a standard tall round and have it as part of the sponge family, where it's really just the label that's the focus and obviously the whiskey inside. But so that's the thinking at the moment, and that's my kind of internal dialogue on that just now. But yeah, it was Gordon MacPhail we bought it from.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, so we have talked about for festivals putting me in like a sponge suit, but I run hot at the best of times, and I think there's a strong chance I would die if I wore a suit of real sponge. We have also discussed doing like actual cartoons, mini cartoons with a sponge. My artist that I do the labels with, he also has a wee animation agency with one of his pals, and it's been discussed. But when you're doing business and you're busy, there's always like dream projects which seem permanently on the back burner and you just never quite get to them. But I'm hopeful that one day we will get to that and do something with it.
If you do, please do get a dunk tank as well, so people can throw softballs and see if they can dunk them.
No, we'd realistically have to fill it with whiskey though, so it would add quite a considerable expense to the whole enterprise. Shall we talk about the next whiskey?
Any more final thoughts from anyone on this one? This one's excellent. Angus, this is like a great way to start. I think it certainly personifies the old Orkney malt. But yeah, anybody else before we move on?
I think all I would say is, given some of the official bottlings of these, if you were going to do anything serious with the Old Orkney brand, I think it would be to make a finished whiskey that emphasizes the distillate in the way that they should be doing as an OB, and sort of doing an homage to what you think the actual OB should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And the dream would be if I could get Scapa as well, but that's next to impossible these days. But 100%. I mean, if we do Old Orkney, it'll be around quite a stronger concept in a slightly larger batch volume, and ideally it would be very much this kind of profile, like plain refill wood, age statement focused, good strong bottling strength, very much putting that beautiful like Orkney malt whiskey flavor front and center. But yeah, who knows, once and I may even start just do a couple of like small batch things just to kick it off and do something nice with it. So yeah, we'll see.
I always thought that's one of the cool things about these, is that we get to taste a lot of underrated, or maybe a better way to say it's underappreciated distilleries like Edgedower, Glen Spey, Croftengea, those things. That's a really nice special thing, because they're discoveries for people like us.
Well, there's a lot out there in whiskey that, and there's some distilleries, as we'll talk to when we get to the Glen Spey, are boring for a reason. But every time you find a diamond in the rough with these makes. So that's what makes whiskey exciting for me, is, you know, having these little discoveries. And in the same token, doing indie bottling is when you find a really good cask of something that you wouldn't ordinarily expect to get excited about. That's cool. So yeah, the next dram in the lineup is the Glen Moray. So this has been a pretty brand new bottling, and one of which we're, I think, nearly sold out of. So yeah, all these bottlings that we're having tonight are available in the shop, by the way. Some of them we have a bit of stock of, some of them we are down to like our last 2 or 3 bottles on, like the Glen Spey, for example. And you've got have you all been told the discount code? I don't know if you have, but
I will put it in the chat again, and you all have been so kind to offer us a special code as well as some bottles coming back. So, yep.
So yeah, so any purchase made between now and I think Tuesday or either end of Monday UK time, but you'll get 10% off your order, any order you place through our web shop. If you just apply that code SpongeUSA at checkout, it'll do it for you. So yeah, this is the Glen Moray, and it's edition 65B. So it's actually the sequel edition to 65A, which was 1991 Glengarry, and this is a 1992 Glen Moray. Both of them are 30 years old, and both of them had exactly the same maturation profile. 10 years initially in plain refill hogshead, then re-rack into a fresh port hogshead, and matured for a further 20 years. So 30 years old in total, and a real proper double maturation. And the thing I love about both of them is that the actual manifestation of the port character is pretty vivid. I mean, you can tell from the color straight away this is going to be quite a rich dram, but I don't find it, like I often find with port influenced whiskies, I don't find it cloying. The length of time it's sat in that cask has led to really full integration. And on top of this, I also think that Glen Moray as a spirit is very good at aging and very good at adapting to these kinds of slightly stronger, sweeter wine, sherry cask type influences. And this one, the port is, I find it anyway, I find it quite jammy and sweet, but it's rounded by deeper, drier layers of tobaccos and earthier tones, and like a little bit of bitter chocolate. And I find these characteristics very harmonious because they complement each other, they balance each other out. And then on the finish, I got this lovely rancio character. Like when I talk about rancio, I'm talking more about characteristics that normally associate with sherry casks rather than port. It's going towards this sort of leathery, walnutty, slightly herbal Fernet Branca dryness, and it's just matched very nicely by those sweeter, jammier things which hold it in check. These kind of red fruit characteristics, which are much more classic port. But I think this would be a fascinating one to pour blind. Like if you had a bunch of geeks around a table, open that tasting with everyone getting a glass of this blind, I'm sure you would get 100 different answers before you got something close to what it actually is. And it's one that I was really happy with. This was a pair of casks, the Glengarry and the Glen Moray, that we bought from just a private individual. It tends to be private individuals that have these kind of like slightly more wacky, crazy casks these days. There's not many companies doing this kind of long-term, forward into the future thinking, planning, like, okay, I've got a 10-year-old whiskey, I'll put it in this cask, but really leave it for a proper, long double maturation. And also I think there's just a very kind of juicy, gooey decadence about it. Like this is a whiskey that demands a large measure in a tumbler and your feet up, and a long film to just wallow and indulge in, or your favorite vinyl on, or something, just something cozy and comforting. It's that kind of whiskey in my mind and to my palate. Cigar whiskey, exactly. This is perfect cigar whiskey.
I see a lot of people kind of chewing it. Like you can see like their faces kind of like, like every kind of like movement of your mouth, it changes a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely it's got a texture in there. And I think the strength is also really nice. It's natural cask strength, 49.7. And there's just a lot of things that have gone right for this whiskey. Like the natural strength sitting just below 50 is, it balances power with accessibility. The number of bottles is pretty low. Things like 142 is all that came out of the cask. So there was obviously quite a concentrative maturation effect going on by, probably throughout most of the last 5 years of its life. It's probably just getting more and more syrupy and thick, and that's where this kind of really textural chewiness coming from on the palate. So yeah, I was really pleased with how this one turned out. I did them just the other day. I was doing a comparison with the Glengarry. The Glengarry is much lower strength. It's like 41.4, I think, natural cask strength. And being Glengarry, it's also got a slight thread of earth and medicine and peat smoke, really just winking beneath the surface there. So it's funny how, despite all that maturation effort from the port and the age, the distillery characters still have some voice in there, and you can still spot that they're a component of the final picture, which is really nice to see. So yeah, this is exactly the sort of thing that I love to do with Decadent Drinks, is just find cool casks and do stuff which is a little bit different, and stuff that you wouldn't ordinarily find, I don't think. I mean, we got lucky for sure, but with a few things we'll try tonight, it's that's a story I'll come back to, is really just trying to pick things which are going to be provocative of opinion, or get people talking, or just downright delicious and a bit different.
I think something that strikes me, it's for me it's a 7-second journey. It starts off totally different than what it finishes at, and the nose is super sweet. I think I said raisin, and in the end it's like that Fernet Branca. I think I said Amaro, but like that bitter herbal thing, and it takes like that 7 seconds to go from start to finish, and it's wonderful how you can experience that in your mouth.
Yeah, exactly. The length and the evolution of flavor, sort of like a little domino thing, one after the other. Pop,
Yeah,
pop, pop. It's really, yeah, it's a lovely physical experience, I think, and that's something we talk about flavor a lot in whiskey, but also the physicality of whiskey and the way it feels in your mouth, the way it makes you feel, that sort of tingling feeling of like, oh, damn, this is a really pleasurable, delicious thing I'm chewing on here. That is a big part of the pleasure and enjoyment of whiskey for me. And so when you get a dram that really ticks that box, that's what it's all about for me. In fact, do you know what? I'm just going to go and have something. I said I probably wasn't going to dram along tonight, but it's been a long day, so I might just have a little.
And thank you again for spending your evening with us.
No, I'm happy to. Yeah, it's nice to spend it with a bunch of like-minded geeks like myself.
Yeah, this is special. This is really nice.
This just reminds me of a really fantastic cognac that the wood bitterness hasn't taken over. I do have a question though. How would you compare Roncillo in something like this compared to a cognac?
Well, in cognac, I don't always find it in cognac. I tend to really enjoy cognacs where I do find it. They tend to be a bit older, and for it to appear in cognac, it needs, I think, comparatively more age than in whiskey necessarily. Probably because in whiskey it tends to come from sherry cask influence, which is much more assertive and apparent at much younger ages than the way cognacs tend to mature, because they often are started out in active wood and then put into very light or neutral wood for long extended periods of aging. So to me, Rancio in cognac, when it starts to become really apparent and set in, like after probably 40 years plus, it's really going much more into like pure leather and tobacco and cigars and humidor and that kind of vibe. In whiskey, and certainly in something like this, I think it's more to do with walnuts and liqueurs, herbal liqueurs, green walnut liqueur, and umami, like liquid umami seasonings, and there tends to be more of a saltiness that can be brought into that component. So I think it's perhaps broader spectrum in whiskey and more narrow, but perhaps more intense in cognac. And yeah, it's very fascinating. I mean, I'd love one day to do like a sort of a Rancio focused tasting of multiple spirits. I think they did something like that one year, but just using whiskies at the London Whiskey Show. I can't remember what whiskies they put in the lineup, but you know, it tends to be something which is very much almost exclusively derived from you know, nicely sherried, often old style sherry cask whiskies. And that's why it's quite charming to find it in something where it's a port cask that's done that. And I'm sure a big part of that is because it was, you know, a good 20 years in that port cask.
Is there anybody here that usually is not attracted to sherried, especially like deeper sherried casks? That anybody here that usually isn't? And I'm wondering how you feel about this. Does this fit in that same realm, or is this a little bit different in some ways?
I can speak. I mean, modern sherry casks are just usually a little bit too much. I think my preferred sherry bomb these days is the Edredor 12-year-olds. And I just find that they're kind of, the seasoned casks are just kind of overly homogenous, especially the first fill. And I think one of the things that this has that those don't is, doesn't have, that I don't like, is it doesn't have too much of the wood tannin and spice that you find in some of those. That tends to just kind of be monotonous.
A lot of modern sherry casks are essentially just active wood that's been strategically short-term seasoned with, you know, something cheap, very cheap sherry that's essentially destined to become distilled or turned into vinegar. And the old style sherry casks tended to be older wood used for longer, with less heat treatment, crucially as well. And they tended to contain sherries for longer that were destined to be drinking sherries. So already there's a layer of quality way above, but they were products, they were incidental products of an industry which has since changed drastically, which is why those profile and style sherry casks is such a hard thing to find nowadays, and such a rarity. I think there's more thought and care going into sherry seasoning and sherry cask stuff now. So I think over time, I mean, the problem is you're talking like a decade for these things to start to become manifest in product. And also because a lot of people are using them for short-term re-rackings and finishings. And, you know, to get the real benefit, I do believe you need to go more into like double maturation territory. So that's, for me, more than 2 years, ideally 3, before a cask starts to, you know, knit with the distillate and balance and bring harmony and cohesion in a single complete characteristic. That's why I'm not really a fan of finishes generally, because I find they tend to produce imbalanced or slightly jaggy whiskies. And to answer the question that popped up there, that long in the wood, even both being used casks, were you worried about losing the character of the spirit underneath? Not necessarily, because to be honest with you, Glen Moray, I don't tend to think of it as being a specific flavor profile of Glen Moray. I tend to think of its character as being its quality, its adaptability, its easiness. And I think that it's, as I said earlier, it's a whiskey that ages well, takes to sherry very well. And sometimes with an older whiskey, you don't mind losing a little bit of the distillery character. What you're left with is a very high quality, like mature Speyside malt whiskey flavor profile. That's a thing of beauty when it's done well. And in this case, I think that's a good example of that. And although blind, I mean, I don't think I would ever pegged it as Glen Moray straight away. But I think if someone gave this to me blind, I would still go, wow, that's luscious. I love that. That's, to me, that's like a fruity old sherry cask matured Speyside malt, which is a profile I really enjoy. So yeah, I wasn't too worried, no. I mean, there's always a bit of concern when you're dealing with a cask like this and you read the description on paper and you're like, oh, I better get a sample of this because it could be way overcooked. But we got samples and everything, so I was comforted by tasting them. There was never in doubt. Yeah, cool. So
this was 142 bottles. This was in a Port Barrique. I don't know, Port Barrique's not as big as a port pipe, right? Those are different.
No. So it's essentially a hogshead in size.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and there's no actual sherry influence in this one. The sherry references I'm making are just more about how it makes me think of sherry casks, perhaps more than port casks. Cool. So that's the Glen Moray. we are about to move to our next dram, which is the Glen Spey. So Glen Spey is just a straight single cask. And we did this for WhiskySponge edition 80. Every 10th Sponge edition, I like to do something a bit special and ideally a bit different. But this was another private cask we got the chance to buy. And on the paper, what I saw was like, holy hell, that sounds mad. It was originally sitting at natural cask strength of 65%. And when I sampled it, I thought that, well, this is fantastic, but it needs to come down a bit. So we reduced it to 60. And even after we did that, there was only 114 bottles left in the cask. And this was a whiskey which had matured, just a plain refill hogshead, full term maturation in that hogshead, distilled 89, 32 years old. And it had matured in a particularly, I think, dry warehouse, and one that was probably above average temperature in Scotland. So it's about as close as Scotland gets to like warm climate maturation. So when we reduced it, that was the sweet spot for me. It just brought out all this honey and made me think of really like more of an early 70s Speyside malt kind of character, but still at 60%. It's so, it packs such warmth and power, but without being harsh or overly dominating. So really for me, it was a whiskey about pollens, flowers, honey, and kind of like fruit salad juices. And it's just luscious, very classical refill matured Speyside distillate character. And Glen Spey, I mean, who cares about Glen Spey? It's one of the most, it's up there with Strathmill in terms of boring distilleries, but it can make a charming spirit. And this, for me, is probably one of the best examples I'd ever tasted of Glen Spey. So I was pretty keen to do this for Sponge Edition 80. And yeah, I'm curious to see what everyone thinks of this one, because yeah, I think it's pretty tasty stuff.
Super nice. I think we'll go outside.
Oh. Wait, what was that? We couldn't hear you, Jeff, or maybe I couldn't. But, oh, maybe he was just talking to someone else. I think the nose is like very pleasant surprise. It's like, whoa, this is really, really fruity, really, really nice.
Yeah, it has a particular sort of green fruit lusciousness, which that's what I really associate in my head with slightly older style Speysiders. Silence. It's always a good sign.
Yeah, that finish just goes on and on.
Yeah, it's definitely a slow sipper, patient, contemplative dram, this one. It's one for, whereas the Glen Moray before it is like, put a big slug in a tumbler, put your feet up and forget the woes of the world. This is very much a kind of just quiet, reverential focus. And also because it's still 60%, it's been reduced already, but again, it's so much further to go. It's one of those whiskies where you could really play around with a pipette and just like keep putting in single drops of water, and you just get all these new layers, and it changes the profile gradually every time. And there's a lot of detail and I think a lot to unpick in this whiskey, which is cool because there's not many bottles of it. Yeah, it's a pretty special dram, I think.
Yeah, it's lovely. I think it's probably playing just a trick of the mind, but I always hear you're supposed to pick out like almond oil in Glen Spey, and I do think I pick up some like nutty notes on this one as well, in addition to kind of the honey and the green notes.
Nice.
And we see Glen Spey less than we see Spey, right? I mean, those are two separate distilleries. Correct?
Yeah, so well, there's Speyside Distillery, there's Glen Spey Distillery, and the brand Spey is associated with Speyside Distillery. Glen Spey is one of Diageo's just blending beasts that just pumps out spirit for, I suppose, Johnny Walker, I think, is one of the key things that goes into. And people talking about like, yeah, pollens, slightly floral. I do find all that kind of like that nice heady meadow flowers, summer flowers, that kind of characteristic, and pollens and nectars and these sorts of things that are all absolute textbook, sort of lovely, mature Speyside whiskey characteristics to me. I don't really have a sense of Glen Spey and what its distillery character would be. If someone said to me to sort of describe Glen Spey, I would just say something like, I don't know, Glen Speyside. Just has a quite generic Speyside-y profile, which, you know, in this day and age, you could arguably say about quite a lot of them. But, you know, I just think of this not so much as being specifically about it being Glen Spey. It's just a really nice cask that's had an interesting maturation profile and has led to a really tasty end result.
But is that what Olaf you were saying about the almond oil? Is that like is that out there that people talk about? That's the note.
It's one of those notes that pops up. I've read in literature and seen, but I don't know if I'm sure they actually have changed the profile over the years as well. I'd be surprised.
Yeah. And Angus, these last two, the Glen Moray and this one, these are the ones that just came out, right? These came out what, like maybe less than 2 weeks
Yeah,
ago?
they came out just like, yeah, last month, a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And we have, I think the Glen Spey is the one we took it down because I was trying to save the last few bottles for this tasting in case any of you guys wanted it. So I just put it back up in the shop. And the Glen Moray we don't have much left of either. A few more, but yeah, they're all up in the shop. Everything's.
This is excellent. Yeah, 3 drams so far, 3 very different drams. And Richard, you posted a cryptic description of this.
Yeah.
Did you ever? I'm sure you had a question about that too.
I just saw that on the website. So are you really stopping at 100, Angus?
I'm going to stop doing Sponge as a single cask edition series at edition 100. There may still be other sponges as like slightly larger batch themed products. I'm going to say large batch, you know, like if we do small batch blended malt, like 1,000 bottles with a specific flavor theme or something, I might do that as a sponge special. But I'm quite conscious that it's a lot of like cerebral work to create all these labels and these designs. And there's a few things that motivate this decision. One is I want to have a bit of a opportunity to reset and refresh. I want to set us a new creative challenge. I think it's important to not just do the same thing time and time again forever. And it's important if you're a company that is about creativity to set yourself new challenges, to put out new stuff, and to not let things get stale. And I care a lot about Sponge. I don't want it to become boring and stale. So it's not that it's going to go away forever as a brand, but I think we'll get to edition 100, tie Sponge as that series off, and it's one set, it's a complete set series. And then I've got plans for something else, another brand which shares many of the characteristics of Sponge, that will supersede it, that will follow on from it. And that'll be another thing which hopefully will be quite interesting for people to follow along from the outset, and will really embrace like original artwork and sort of quite a nice high concept idea. So I won't say any more about it, obviously it's still in development, but that sort of, I would imagine around about, I don't know, April, May next year, that might be the time that we do the changeover. So yeah, something to look forward to. But it will be very much still the same Decadent Drinks philosophy of being silly, having fun, but with, you know, really high quality liquid at the heart of it.
And for the mega tasting with all 100 bottles, I think Jonathan's going to help us out with that, right? Jonathan is our
Yeah, it's very impressive. He's been doing sterling work.
I'm currently tracking. The first thing I did this morning when getting set up for the tasting was check the whiskey auctioneer. I'm still trying to get bottles. My wife tells me that I can't do multiple tastings, but we'll see about that. She does have no problem. She's already approved the cask purchase of the new distillery. Do you want to talk about that? I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, the distillery. So yeah, I, with my other business partners, Johnny and Aaron, we are starting a distillery, and the distillery is called Kythe, Kythe, which is an old Scots word which means to become known, to show. And it's really like it's a lifelong project for us. And it's been done off the back of our shared love of and sort of professional work within the field of old and rare whiskies, old bottles, essentially. And I wrote a blog post about this on WhiskySponge, which you can, it's the first one on the website. So if you go to whiskysponge.com, you can see it. If you go to kythedistillery.com, you can read more on our website about it. And you can sign up as well to our mailing list for information on, when we're going to launch and do some cask sales, things like that. So the concept is really to make a proper old style Highland malt whiskey flavor profile single malt. And everything about this has been designed around executing that project and that vision. And it's, it's going to be a smallish scale, but about 50,000 liters a year, but made through a sort of a proper commercial size kit, a 1 ton mash tun. We're doing things like directly wood firing the wash still with worm coils, and essentially the flavor profile of something like 60s Springbank, 60s Bowmore, 60s Longmorns. These sorts of stunning flavors are really what we're chasing. And I think the difference between us and maybe quite a lot of distilleries that start is either they start with people that have got cash or land, or they've done years and years in the industry and they want to I don't know, some people want a cushy consultancy job, or I don't know, people that start a distillery and they've got eyes on cash and tourism, and the whiskey itself seems to take a back seat, or they know they want to make whiskey, but they really are just at the outset of a journey and they want to figure it out. Whereas I think we came to it with having really deep experience in our field, good knowledge, and a very clear vision of what we wanted to do. We just didn't have any money, which was challenging, and why it took 10 years to get this project to the point where we're comfortable enough to talk about it. So that's Kythe. And you can go and read a bit more. There's a podcast episode on the Scotch Malt Whisky Society's whiskey talks, or I can't remember what the name of their podcast is, but Scotch Malt Whisky Society podcast. Search that out and you'll find one with myself and my colleague Johnny McMillan talking about it. So that's the other thing. It's exciting, means I'm probably bitten off more than I can chew and very busy doing a bottling company and a whiskey distillery. But all things being well, we should commence production around mid to late 2024. So watch this space. And
as we transition, Angus, to the 4th dram, now that we're in the midway point, and by the way, everybody, all of our questions so far have been really PC. Don't be afraid to ask them the really tough questions, the really burning questions you have, and also any comments about what you love, what you don't like, all of that. But as we transition to the last 3 over the next 45 minutes or so that we have with you, Angus, we did have one question about shipping, and a couple of folks here and all of us most of us here have probably ordered some bottles from you, and it's pretty simple to order direct to the United States, and that's what I always liked about working with you or talking to you about these bottles, is that I can get it right to my door, which is really nice. So do you want to kind of elaborate how shipping works for anybody here that hasn't ordered with you? I know you've been so kind to also offer us a discount code. Is there a promo on shipping as well? Tell us all about that as we transition now to the Croftengea as we all pour it.
So we ship using DHL and another agent as well, which does the actual takes care of the sort of importing side of it. It's not shipping I will say shipping is not my area of expertise in the company. We have a shit hot operations manager called Gillian, who is essentially the nerve center of Decadent Drinks and runs everything. And she is in charge of our shipping stuff. If you want to ask any specific, more detailed questions about how it works, because I mean, as far as I'm aware, you put stuff in your basket, pay for it, and then a few days later it arrives at your door very handily. That is essentially how it works in actuality. In terms of more detail on that, if you have any questions, just message me them, and I can or give them to James and he can pass them along to us, and we can get Gillian to note down some answers for you. I'm happy to do that. At the moment, we've got an offer with the 10% off on any order size. And in the past, we've done some deals around a minimum purchase size gets you free shipping to America. Because of course, with America, we can't do like traditional importing. We're not a big enough company yet to really do, work with the 3-tier system in a way that works for us. We don't have sufficient margin in our price models to allow that. So being able to ship directly and then to nurture these sorts of relationships more directly with you guys as consumers and whiskey lovers, that's our strategy, and one that I really like. It's refreshing to just deal directly with fellow drinkers and whiskey lovers rather than necessarily the tangles of dealing with another importer. I love my importers, don't tell them I said that, but yeah. So that's our sort of our approach with America, really, is just find ways to to push and motivate our direct sales to customers. And in future, we may bring back a free shipping deal. I'm not sure when, but there is one being looked at that we may implement reasonably soon for America. But I don't have any further details on that yet because it's not my decision. Again, my department at Decadent Drinks really is products. So my job title there is head, although I'm a director of the company as well and a shareholder in it, but I'm called head of products, and I do all the decisions around what goes into bottle, what we bottle, managing the supply of that, sourcing, buying, and also the design of the labels and the sort of the tone of voice of the company. So I do the follow-on work with our with Julia, who does our marketing, and so that's really my role and the things I know about. And if you have any more specific detailed questions about shipping, for example, I would just say let us know and we can find out for you. But it should be, for most, I think there's a number of states we can't ship into, but I think it's like half of them we can ship into, and I think the information's in the FAQs on our website, and should be relatively straightforward if you're in a state where we can ship.
I will say I've ordered at least probably once a month for like the last year, and I've never had an issue.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, good packaging and everything. So really good packaging, actually. So a couple other folks have just joined, and sorry about any technical issues. I think we, Zoom's a reminder that these are really easy to do when you have folks in a lot of different places, but there are technical issues sometimes. So I apologize for that. But we welcome any questions, thoughts. We're a small enough group. If you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, just jump out and say it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Angus, Croftengea. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Croftengea?
Croftengea, yeah, that's right. So Croftengea is one of the many different makes produced by Loch Lomond Distillery, and they tend to name their different malts after all the various little islands on Loch Lomond itself. So you've got Inchmone, Inchfad, and Croftengea is one of them, and they've made it for, I think, since the 90s or late 90s. They've been producing this one, and it's essentially a double pot distilled single malt from peated barley. So it's quite a classical style and production on paper. But what Loch Lomond do, and what I think it shows really nicely in this example, is they do some pretty fun stuff with fermentation, which involves traditional, quite sort of normal standard distilling yeasts combined with wine yeasts and champagne yeasts in order to incept much more intense fruit flavor into their whiskies. It's even more apparent in whiskies like Inchmurrin, which is another make of theirs, and that's unpeated double distilled malt, which is really designed as like a clone of Little Mill and has really big, luscious fruitiness. And this Croftengea is, I think, a really lovely example of a slightly different profile of peat in Scottish malt whiskey. A lot of us know Islay whiskies, familiar with that style, some Highland peated malts, some of the other Islanders. And this is something that's quite different again. It's a nice, robust, full-bodied, peaty dram, but because it's been through a slightly different fermentation process, which really starts to involve a lot of fruit in there, the way the fruit flavor interplays with the peat, especially on the palate. To me, this is a lovely nose whiskey, but the surprise comes on the palate, where you get this big detonation of, I think, really nice, juicy green and tropical fruits. And I think that the way that dovetails with the sort of crisp, dry peat smoke is a really special combination. And so I really like this whiskey. I think it's great value for money. I think you're paying for the quality of the spirit, and the fact that Croftengea is another one of these names that no one really knows much about or thinks much about is an asset in this situation, because we got the cask at, I think, a pretty good price, and we were able to pass that price on into the retail price. And so, yeah, 15 years old, distilled 2007, full term maturation in a standard refill hogshead. And this is another one where we brought it down by about 2 degrees for bottling. So this is another one that's at 57.1, which is, as you remember from earlier, 100 proof, my favorite bottling strength. And again, that reduction by 2 degrees, it just tweaked the fruitiness in it, just magnified it that little bit. And it shows really well in the bottle, I think, as a result. So this is another one where I'm really happy with the result. Oh yeah, and any Star Trek fans will appreciate the label, of course, as well. And I like Loch Lomond anyway. It's a distillery that for years suffered from, I think, owners that didn't care about it much. It had one product which was pretty largely shit and bad cask selection, but they've got an incredible still room with every possible combination. They're doing really interesting stuff in there. If you get a chance to try their grain whiskey, I'm not really a fan of grain whiskey, but they make grain by putting malt whiskey through a column still, and they've done peated barley, peated single malt through a column still, and made grain whiskey from that, and it's really, really nice. You'll remember, some of you, from the last tasting I did here, where we had the Old Rosdu. That's another great example of a really good, slightly different but really fruity, interesting Loch Lomond malt. And they do lots of different ones, and I think it's a really fascinating company. It's a fascinating distillery, and that if you start to explore them, there's a wealth of treasure there that I think still to this day a lot of people aren't really looking at that much. So you can still find a lot of nice examples of indies for pretty good prices. I think a lot of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society bottlings of Loch Lomond makes tend to be very good. So that's something else that's worth exploring. But certainly, I'm looking around for doing more of these, and yeah, hopefully we can continue to explore Loch Lomond as we go along. But
really nice balanced dram. Really pleasant.
It's also quite citrusy now as well. And it's got a profile that almost reminds me a little bit of some Bowmores, modern Bowmores, with this kind of nice exotic fruit and sort of coastal smokiness on the palate. Yeah, I'm really happy with that. That's cool. It's a nice whiskey.
And this follows the Rosdu in the last tasting we had, Angus, which was I think David Levine, he said that was special too. So but do they have, like, does anybody, or do you think that there's some familiarity? I mean, that was old. That was a 29 year, I think it was.
Yeah.
Do you see a lot of familiarity in a lot of the old other Loch Lomond 6 varieties?
So there's a couple of characteristics that I do think that a lot of their makes share. One of which is just a fruitiness, which is in varying levels and varying degrees, but I think are quite pronounced. Sometimes bubblegummy, sometimes juicy fruity, sometimes fruit salady, like mixed, slightly overripe, gooey fruitiness. That characteristic can be seen in most of their makes. And also an Irish accent. Like, there's a lot of Loch Lomond whiskies that really make me pause and think, that really reminds me of an Irish whiskey. Like, even this is making me think of some peated coolies that I've had. It's this kind of particular, like, crisp, soft peat smoke combined with these more luscious fruit tones. In some ways it makes me think of Bowmore, like I said, but in other ways it makes me think of peated Irish whiskies, in the same way that the Old Rosdu really did make me think of, like, old school Irish whiskies with that very honeyed, luscious, really overripe fruit characteristics, and like sort of metallic, slightly bike chain, old copper coin, waxy characteristics. These are things that are really like typical pure pot Irish whiskey flavors. And I've been trying a few interesting Irish whiskies lately, and you know, some are spectacular, but the more I try them, the more they make me think in turn of like Loch Lomond makes. So yeah, that would be a broad kind of similarity that I find in a lot of their spirits.
I wouldn't have thought that until you said that, but I could see that. I think it's missing some of the grassy in some of those, but it's not present in all the other Irish, but I could see that for sure. Where do you land on, it's a burning question for me. I don't know if anyone else has the same type of question, but I told you the last 3 are going to be more burning questions. Where do you land when you, like, how does the process work when you choose a label and it's based on, you know, pop culture or other things? You know, is that an issue or is that not an issue?
There's, yeah, you've got to be careful you're not like ripping off IPs essentially that are still protected by copyright. And I've learned the hard way on that. Not that we got sued or anything, but there's a couple of labels where we just had to scrap them because I realized that I'd just gone like just way overboard with stuff I'm technically not allowed to do. But I think so. For example, something like the Glen Spey, where it's Van Gogh, and it's obviously a riff on that. I think it's, you know, it's a pastiche. It's an homage. It's done with love for the original. It's also primarily done because the original is now out of copyright, and no one's going to sue us. In the same way that with this, we haven't used the words Star Trek. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure someone from Paramount would find reason to send a cease and desist letter about this, if I'm being honest. But this was like, I think we just about get away with this. And things like, you know, we checked the font. That font is open source. It's not owned by Paramount or Star Trek or, you know, any of these people. So, so there's always a balance. And like, some people think that maybe there's a cynicism about it because you're leaning on bigger pop cultural properties to try and shift bottles. That's one argument, a cynical argument, I think. But my view is that it's celebratory, it's fun, and we always try to put our own spin on it enough and do something that's original to us and witty enough that that we think makes it our own and justifies doing it. And we can always point to and say, well, we think we've brought enough of ourselves or our own, you know, creativity to this. And you know, at the end of the day, it's just a label on a bottle. So yeah. So yeah, that's how I approach it, is, you know, try to think, you know, is there enough originality plus what's the reason for doing it? Or sometimes it's just that it's a cool idea, and I just, you know, people at the end of the day, people like pop cultural riffs and references and playing around with that stuff. And as long as I'm mixing that up with enough totally off the wall original artworks that are 100% the product of total originality and creativity, then I don't mind. If all we were doing was taking existing properties and kind of just riffing on them, then I think that would stray into territory of being a bit lazy. But I think we balance it enough.
Yeah, we've seen some crazy labels in the US on bourbon that a lot of them you just look at, you're like, there's no way this is legal or not going to get sued. And we're wondering if it's like some, you know, garage operation that puts new labels over old labels. But that's good to hear. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's quite a few people talking about Mickey Mouse going out of copyright. I'm a bit wary about prodding the Disney beast, if I'm honest. There's already one sponge label out there with a Star Wars reference on it, and I'm really hoping that no one at Disney notices. So yeah, I think also like there's so many beer brands that are quite bad for it, just blatant ripping off of IP. And I think that's the other thing about us, is that I do think that although it's important to have fun and be creative, part of being creative is operating within certain confines, like that force you to think creatively and be creative. And like, if you just break the rules all the time and steal stuff, that's not creative, that's cheating. In the same way that I think, you know, whiskey labels, you think, oh, that looks beautiful, that gorgeous artwork. You think they've just literally copied a page from an old dictionary that has gone out of print. That's cheating in my view. because that's not you're not inventing something, you're just photocopying something, which sounds a bit rude because there's probably quite a lot of brands who are run by people that I really like doing that. That's my 2 cents on it. So people liking the Croftengea. I love the mid palate. Yeah, I agree. The palate is what this one's all about, and that middle like little go fruit. That's my favorite aspect of this one.
I know Chris on here is a big bourbon guy, so the fact that he likes the Croftengea and the Peas is really a nice thing to hear too. It's kind of like a gateway whiskey. It's not too hard. It's not too far extreme in any direction. It's a really nice evolution as well in this tasting as the 4th dram. It's kind of, we've tasted a little bit of everything, but it's not overpowering. It's really well balanced.
I also think this one wasn't too expensive, was it?
95 quid.
Yeah, I think that's really reasonable for this.
I think so. You know, named single malt, peated, good strength, 15-year-old age statement. I mean, I think in this day and age, it's a fair price. I mean, you know, pricing is what it is nowadays. It's kind of depressing to talk about, but you know, that's why we don't do too many cheaper bottlings, because to me, finding the ratio of acceptability between price and quality is actually much harder when you go below £100 than above. And I just want to work with the whiskies that I love. So I've taken a view and a sort of policy that, yes, I want to do affordable price bottlings, or, you know, below £100 bottlings, but I'm not going to push it for the sake of it. I'm not just going to bottle 8-year-old boring shit just to tick a box. If I'm going to bottle a cheaper whiskey, I want it to be damn good, and I want it to be something that people who know us and, you know my tastes, know our preferences as a company, our decision making, will have some degree of confidence in and think, you know what, if they've done that, they must have a good reason. I'm going to put my hand in my pocket. That's my view. Like our Equinox and Solstice series, which we focused on last tasting. So the summer one for that this year is, I think, another really good fair price proposition. So it's just under 100 quid, but it's a 15-year-old fully first fill bourbon matured Balblair, and it's really nice, juicy, honeyed, lovely, typical fruit bomb Balblair. And that for me that's really pleasing to do something like that, because you know, it took a bit of work to source those casks, and I think it's paid off with an accessible, really delicious product, which is a nice thing to be able to put out. So yeah, that'll come in June. And on to the Bowmore next. Yeah. So this is one of 2 2003 Bowmores we've done in the last sort of year and a half. First one was WhiskySponge Edition 50, and we bottled that at 53 degrees. And this is from the sibling cask. They're both refill sherry butts. They're both matured both distilled in 2003, but they both had what's called a broken maturation. So these are stocks we bought from Signatory, and they were originally filled into refill sherry butts, matured for, I think, around 14 years or something. And then there was supposed to be a sale of this stock, and the whiskey was taken out of cask, put into IBCs, big vatting containers, preparing for bottling. And the sale fell through. Sale dragged on for ages and eventually fell through. So they found a couple of different refill sherry butts, same cask type, but different, and recast them, and just to continue the maturation. So when I stumbled across these in the warehouse and tasted them, I thought, wow, this is some good shit. I need to have both of these. So we did the first one, edition 50. Again, that's sort of nice, something to celebrate with every 10th edition. And then this one, it had turned another year in cask, and it was quite different to the other one. The other one had more upfront sherry character, sherry color. This one, what I love about it is it's a really equal Venn diagram of fruit, peat, sherry, and coastal. So it's got all the stuff that we love about modern Bowmore, and it's got it in real harmony. And we just did it at cask strength because it was just perfect as it was. Single cask strength, no need for any tampering or changes. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, I adore Bowmore. I think it's going back to that Highland Park conversation is another example where the owners tend to fuck about with it in weird ways, but the indies are doing the best job of like putting that beautiful distillate character front and center. And that for me is what this bottling is about. It's you know, it's beautiful distillery character with just a lovely gentle cloak of sherry, and really harmonious, powerful but balanced, fruity but salty. Yeah, it's just gorgeous. So curious about your relationship with Signatory. Would love to hear detail about your history relationship with them. So we were very lucky to be able to source from Signatory under our own livery, largely because Andrew Symington, its owner, was a fan of the sponge. Every time I would go there, he'd come up and shake my hand and cackle about all the various rude nonsense he'd read on the sponge in the last month or so. And because of that, he was happy to support us. And it was, you know, it's a relationship, you know, it's just done wonders for us over the years. We've been very lucky. We still have a good relationship with them. We don't bottle as much from them, and I think that our days of being able to bottle from them are quite limited, really, because of just the policy they're changing around doing third party. I think they do far less of that going forward. So we'll see. I don't know. It's, you know, we'll continue to work with them for as long as they are happy to do so, and that's something that's changing for all their third party customers, really. So it's not just us, it's everybody. So we'll see how that evolves. I don't know, but you know, we still have a good working relationship with them. Still love them as a company, and you know, they have absolutely been great for us, and that they've been generous with their options and their supply, and yeah, so that's where things are, and how they arrived there, really. But yeah, I'm expecting people will probably enjoy the Bowmore. I really love it, so interested to hear feedback. Again, silence is always a good sign with
That's the sound of savoring. It's classic Bowmore. It's definitely not too sherry, which is really nice. But you get the distillery character, but then you also get the sweetness that in this other smoke that comes out that's really nice. And it takes you in the direction. It's kind of like some of these whiskeys, you kind of like savor it on your palate, and then it kind of you kind of like try to think through where it's going. This one is like very clear and distinct.
Yeah, and it's got a finish on it which I just really love. Just this wonderful, like, just increasing afterglow of tropical fruit, which and for me, tropical fruit is everything in whiskey. It's the holy grail. It's the flavor profile I always look for, but it's also one of the rarest flavors in whiskey nowadays. It used to be all over the place in old style whiskeys. You know, distillates from most distilleries in the 50s and 60s displayed some degree of exotic fruit or another, and that's a thing that's really been eviscerated from the character of Scotch whisky very broadly as a product and a category over the years intervening. It's the flavor profile that is motivating our Kythe project, and it's the flavor that I absolutely love about this Bowmore and would sort of celebrate most in any dram if I find it.
I'd love to ask about fermentation times and how it develops those fruit flavors. I know that buddy of mine went to Bowmore last year, and we were talking about this a while ago, and I haven't found really a satisfactory answer, but I know that the fermentation times will have an impact on the flavor if you have enough faith in your distillate to not overcoat it with too much sherry. It still comes through. Can you talk about that with the new project and in general?
Well, we've absolutely, you know, we've given ourselves the ability to do 2-week fermentations as standard if we need to. Whether we'd end up doing that all the time is to be determined. There seems to be, the problem is that getting industry insiders and scientists and everyone to actually agree on a consensus about what constitutes tropical fruit or where it comes from, or to agree a common parlance around that characteristic is quite a challenge. I know someone that's built a distillery who says also, 60s Bowmore is my motivation, but I get that flavor profile. To me, that's like blackcurrant and bramble fruit, which I totally disagree with. But you know, that's what I mean. That's part of one of the problems is linguistic. So the thinking for a long time was that just longer fermentations did this. But you look at production in Scottish malt whiskey distilleries in the 50s, for example, where there's still quite a lot of data. Fermentation times tended to be longer. But when I say longer, I'm talking, instead of, like, say, 72 hours, like 100 hours plus. And at Bowmore, there's anecdotal evidence that they regularly would have fermented, as long as like 5 days or something like that. So those are pretty long by anyone's standards now in Scotch whiskey. But there's also plenty of examples where there were demonstrably astonishing whiskies made with 48 to 72 hour fermentation times. So something pretty standard. And I think that the issue is fermentation is critical, but so is the type of barley and the level of proteins in it. What base ingredients are you putting into that fermenter for the sugars to respond to and play with? And how efficient is the fermentation? And what sugars are left undigested at the end? Because if you go into a direct fired wash distillation with lots of residual sugars, you maximize Maillard reaction, and you get a quite different distillation profile that magnifies a much weightier, heavier spirit, which I think carries over more fruit flavors as well as waxiness, which is another real old style whiskey characteristic. So it's yeast type, it's length of fermentation, it's provision of raw material in the type of barley, the type of mashing. Have you done clear? Have you done cloudy? A lot of things have to align, I believe, for tropical fruit to really be magnified. The best evidence I think there is Laphroaig and Bowmore in the 60s were using a shared yeast source from one of the Glasgow breweries. They'd have been taking essentially brewer's yeast trub, leftover gunk from breweries, in wooden casks, transporting that on a puffer ship up the Clyde to Islay, and that would be used to inoculate these fermentations. And Bowmore and Laphroaig in the 60s clearly share a very vivid tropical fruit characteristic. And they also, from up until 64 and 67 respectively for Bowmore and Laphroaig, were doing direct coal firing using worm tubs. They were, and a lot more proportion of their own maltings on site with different peat sources. So they're true, like, historic on-site idiosyncratic malt whiskey production examples. And the similarity, I believe, a lot of it is to do with a very inefficient, nutrient-rich brewing yeast as the primary fermenting agent. Phil and Simon share a lot of our ideas and philosophies. I suppose, what they've done has been a bit of a test plan in some ways for a lot of our ideas, and it's been also something we've watched very closely. We've had many conversations with them, tasted a lot of stuff together, and they're similarly inspired by a lot of old style stuff. I think perhaps where the difference is that I think they've been a bit more experimental and used a much smaller kit than what we will do. I think ours is quite conceptually clear from the outset. What we're going to have to do is just play around and tweak a lot of stuff in the first 2 years and really try and figure out, okay, what's working, what isn't working. And then eventually by year 3 or 4, we hope to have honed in on a process and a style that is really, that's our own, that's delivering what we want, that's going in the right direction. We're going to lock in and drill into this. Are you playing direct fire? Yeah, we're doing direct wood firing on the wash still. Coal has obviously got a lot of negative connotations these days. Doing air seasoned, we've got a really good supplier for air seasoned logs, and they are really quite energy efficient. It's unbelievable, actually, the energy efficiency savings by just having a directly wood fired wash still compared to if we had to do steam and a kerosene boiler for a same size kit is 94% energy savings. It's astonishing. And the spirit still is also going to be electrically heated. So, and we're doing it in such a way that mimics a direct firing effect and a certain targeted high temperature effect. So essentially we will be, and both stills will be condensed through worm coils. So we will really be drilling into like pure old school distilling practice with the kit and the methodology of its running.
Did you consider like oil or LPG as an alternative to wood, or why
We
did
looked
you?
at them. We looked at them, but it's it's cost prohibitive, and also we wanted something that was a challenge to control, because I think only through doing that it forces us to really legitimately say we are doing something by hand with skill, which is the original meaning of craft. Like it's, even with gas, you just turn it on, turn it off. There you go. But with logs, you've really got to pay attention, and it'll enable things like whoever's tending the still that day, they'll have their own personal preference, which will lead to these subtle natural variations in batch product character over the course of a year. What we want is a product like what we as nerds, as drinkers, celebrate about things like 60s Bowmore, is that there's always a DNA, but there's always these wonderful undulations and variations of character. So you go, oh, the 66, it's the 64, there's something similar but different. And the thing that really keeps geeks entertained, that's the thing we want to achieve with Kythe, a distillery character which is always visible and clear and distinct, but that subtly varies by season and by batch, and in a way that gives us a lot to talk about and lots to play with when it comes to putting bottlings together.
I can imagine like workplace safety regulations have changed a lot over the last, since it was more common to have like open direct fired stills. Is that going to be like a complication in this too?
From the health and safety and from the like legal angle and everything, that's all been very well taken care of by our engineering team and our design team. We're lucky to have, I think, several like engineering geniuses working on this project who love the challenge, and so that component, things like safety and way to manage it, has been very well thought through. Other distilleries, so first of all, remind me of the location of the distillery. So it's going to be in Perthshire, just about 20 minutes north of Blairgowrie, just outside Blairgowrie is the nearest sort of largest town. But it's on an old farm, and there's two large agricultural buildings we're converting. One's going to be the distillery, one's going to be the warehouse. Any other distilleries still doing direct fired? In Scotland, you have Springbank, Glenfarclas, also Glenfiddich still doing some direct firing. Dornoch have done a little bit of direct firing, but again, all these guys are using gas. The only other distillery at the moment using direct wood as a flame heating source is Shizuoka in Japan, that we're aware of. You've also got quite a few people in Cognac still doing distillation off wood, and some of the ideas about their methods have been brought into the design of the stills for Kythe. Anyway, I better do the last dram before we get too carried away. We can talk about these things for hours. So the final dram tonight, what's cool tonight, we've had we've not really had edition 50, but we've had a sister cast to edition 50, had edition 80, and now we're going to have edition 70. And these are always, the round numbers are always something that I think is special. So that's a good indication. If you see, I don't know what we're going to do for 90. I've got one cask in mind for that, which I think should be pretty special. So this is, WhiskySponge edition 17. It's a Ledaig, so heavily peated whiskey made at Bowmore Distillery on the Isle of Mull. And it's a 2005 vintage, and it's two sibling sherry casks, two sherry butts, second fill sherry butts. So first of all, straight up from the color, you can tell there's an obvious level of activity in the sherry, which is actually quite surprising for second fill. Makes me think their first fill was probably very young. The next thing to note is the strength, 62.8 or 62 point, I can't remember, but 60, just over 62. And these two butts were both from a warehouse where it was like the Glen Spey. It was quite a dry, above average temperature, concentrative warehouse where you see there's only 312 bottles came out of the cask on this bottling, and that's from two full butts. So a huge amount of evaporation has occurred, and one of them had even less liquid in it, and one of them had a slightly bit more. The one with a little bit more was about 61%, and the one with not much at all was up at 68%. And because they were sat next to each other at Signatory, and it was easy to access them, I got them to dump one of the casks in on top of the other a few months before we bottled it. So they did have a chance to marry on this occasion, which I think has also helped a lot. So it's a small batch, double cask bottling, and I think this is just an absolute powerhouse sherry and peat bomb, and it has a fusion of sherry and peat and a concentration together that is very rare in this day and age. It's a flavor profile that's very hard to find now, and it really reminds me more of some much older Ledaigs from the 70s, with this like intense, oily, tarry peat, almost like black olives and roof pitch, and then the saltiest, most licoricey, dense, game meat ridden sherry. And it has this sort of pickled walnut rancio vibe as well that we talked about earlier. Salted almonds and, you know, smoked fish even. It's like, it's a big beast of a dram. And yeah, I really love it. And I said that about all of them, but it's a strong lineup tonight. They're all drams that are, to me, are a wee bit special. So it's a good absolute monster to close on. And you can see why we held this one for the end.
Yeah, good choice. This is a hot pan dram where you touch it and you're trying to test it. Is it hot? Is it hot? Like you keep going back for a little bit more each time versus diving right in.
Yeah, and this is natural cast strength. And again, similar comment to things like the Glen Spey. You know, you could sit for a long time with a pipette and some water and really go to town on dissecting this one and pulling it apart and getting layer after layer after layer. Yeah, it's a gorgeous dram. And again, going back to that thing about Decadent Drinks bottlings, it's one that's also potentially divisive because it's quite extreme. It's not boring. There's a lot to say about it, and it would be a very good one to pour for a bunch of geeky whiskey pals around the table, blind, and just see what people think. Because yeah, it's one of those like quite a physical whiskey that just can't help but provoke some kind of response in the taster.
I will say this one comes from Signatory. Yes.
Yeah, this was Signatory stock. Yeah.
I have a similar bottling to this. I think from the same year, from maybe 2019 or 2020, that was done for the Whiskey Exchange, and it is even more intense than this. It is. I've even tried to blend it with some other things. It's one of the most intense whiskeys I've ever had.
So that one is the one that came out quite recently, and it's like 67 or 65%. I've got a sample of it, actually, I think.
I thought I got it in 2020 or 2021. I can't remember.
Okay, so maybe, yes, maybe, but it will probably be from the same parcel if it's a 2005. I tried a few of them, and these two really stood out because they had a much more intense sherry character. The other ones tend to be a bit paler, and I find them, the intensity is still there, but I find them perhaps too singular and aggressive. Whereas with this one, that the power of the peat, the power of the alcohol, the power of the sherry, they all kind of balance each other out. There's not one single component which is way more dominating than the others. So therefore it achieves balance, and bringing the two sherry butts together really helped with that. With the other ones that are done as single casks at 65, you know, natural cask strength. So if I'd had one of those other casks on their own, I would have been tempted to reduce them for bottling. Whereas with this one, I think the two casks being mixed together kind of did that job for me, and I didn't need to do anything else. So yeah, that's why I sort of enjoyed these ones most of all, really, over the others.
I mean, let's be clear. This one is better. It's much more, has a lot more balance.
I'm glad you said that for me, Jonathan. Thank you.
I flat out just a better whiskey. I will fully admit that I am a fanboy, but I tend to, and I'm not the only one that thinks so. Been trying to make friends with some serious collectors here in Seattle, and one of them, in his words, that you're a genius. Just want to let you know that's the word on the street.
That's I'm not a genius, but that's very kind.
And this gentleman is a very serious, seasoned collector. Lots of, his specialty is closed distilling or closed distilleries. So
nice. Well,
very well versed.
One of the best experiences for me, whiskey-wise, ever was actually tasting whiskey from the original Stromness distillery. And at my wedding, I'm getting married in a couple of weeks' time, and all the tables are named after distilleries. And There's a few like really rare closed distilleries in there, like Stromness, Glenfine. And if anyone asks like why this selection, the answer is because I'm pretty confident I'm the only person alive that's tasted whiskey from all of these distilleries. I don't know if that's definitely true, but I think it might be. So if anyone asks, that's my show off comment. But yeah, I mean, I increasingly as time goes on, I find myself revisiting closed distilleries, because when I started out like my whiskey journey, for want of a better word, things like Portellen, Glenlochy, Glenougie, Rora, they were quite abundant actually, and you could easily try them. And now that's not the case anymore. And I find myself, whenever I get the opportunity, trying to taste these things again, because they are special. You know, they were closed for a reason. They were inefficient by Diageo stroke, you know, the big company standards. That's why they closed them. And as a result, we lost some of the most charismatic, interesting, beautiful makes as a result. But yeah, that's a bit of a sidetrack, but yeah.
Jonathan, those antlers in the background, I'm having a hard time getting off that. I'm having a hard time taking you seriously with those antlers.
I think it's a good
Well,
look
that's
with
the
the check shirt. You've got very strong huntsman energy coming off you.
I actually am talked to my father this morning, and I know you and I have talked about venison before. Planning a hunt in upstate New York this year, and I located a discontinued CZ 550 FS. It's the old Mannlicher stocked model in 6.5 Swedish Mauser. So I'm going to be doing some deer hunting later this year. And I just bought some Imperial Porter last night, and I plan on making steak and ale pie next weekend.
Very nice.
That is, what part of the States do you live in again, Jonathan? Remind me.
I'm in Seattle. If you're ever in the area, I have friends both at Copperworks and at Westland, so we can arrange some tastings if you are interested.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to come over to that side of the country. I tend to be on the East Coast more commonly, because that's just where I've had like my work colleagues that live in America. They're all based around that neck of the woods, and previously I've had friends in New York and everything. But it's been a long time since I was last on the west coast of the States. I'd love to go back one day soon, hopefully.
I'm sure we could arrange a very warm welcome for you here in Seattle, my friend.
West coast is the best coast. I mean, in Scotland, I frequently say west is best as a west coaster myself, so I can appreciate that that sentiment. So listen, I'm gonna have to head off, but if anyone has any last minute questions you want to ask, we can do that now. But similarly, let me just say, I really appreciate you guys doing this. I really appreciate James's efforts in putting this together and doing this tasting and organizing it and bringing all of you together. I always enjoy coming and chatting to you guys, and it's, you know, it's humbling to get nice feedback, to get good questions, to have like-minded, interested people, you know, try bottlings that we put out. And, you know, we put a lot of work into doing these, so it's nice to get useful and positive feedback. And yeah, thank you for joining and taking time on your Sunday to do this, and hopefully we can do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, kudos to all the West Coast folks that are joining earlier in the day, and a special kudos to you, Angus, for joining and sharing your love and passion for whiskey with us. I asked in the chat what was everyone's favorite. It was kind of all over the board. There, at least each bottle got called out as someone's favorite, so that's always a very pleasant surprise. But then also a testament to all the hard work you put into choosing really good casks, and that was something that came out when we were on the third or fourth dram about the trust that you build with an independent bottler over time. In the US, we see a lot of younger whiskey coming out, which is fine, but there's a lot of it out there, and there's less of these types of opportunities to try it before you commit to buying a bottle, because we all have overflowing cellars and cabinets full of whiskey. So the opportunity to spend this time with you is very treasured for all of us, and we really, really thank you for taking the time to share your evening with us. And you're getting married in, 2 weeks. So yeah. We know that we appreciate your wife as well, for your future wife, for allowing you to spend the time with us. But yeah, if anybody has a final question, final thought for Angus before he leaves, and we'll stay on for a little bit longer. I know a couple folks might have missed the first couple of drams. We'll revisit those, and I'll turn off the recording. But anybody, feel free if you have any last minute questions for Angus before he drops off.
I'll be very brief. Give my thoughts. My favorite was the last one, the Ledaig. It was just fantastic. At 62%, it just drank so easy. I poured it without looking at the percentage, and then I looked at it. I was like, I can't believe that's 62%. It was just, I mean, it's powerful, but the flavor just overpowers the alcohol. The Bowmore for me was great, but I've had there's been a string of 18-year-old Bowmores from the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society that have all been very good. This is right in line with that tropical notes, just right there. The one that really just took me by surprise that I've probably had it before, but I don't remember, is and I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure, the Croftengea. I just keep going back.
Yeah.
I keep going back to that little bottle and sniffing it. It's got a waxiness to the nose and a fruity floralness to the nose, but then I mean, man, it's just fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm glad you like that one. It's I think it's a bit of a clever sleeper dram that, you know, if we'd done this lineup blind, it would have been very interesting to see what the sort of the results were, or the feedback was, or the guesses were. And yeah, with the Ledaig, that idea of things being approachable even at high cask strengths, that's always to me a sign of a very good quality whiskey, when even at cask strength and even with like all that power, it can still be very enchanting and very approachable. And yeah, so yeah, thank you all very much again, and I will bid you good night, good afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you all are. And hopefully we'll do another one of these at some point in the not too distant future. But until then, cheers. And yeah, all these bottles should be in the shop. You've got a discount code. It's there for the next sort of 24 hours at least, for sure. So, you know, by all means, please do make use of it. And yeah, all the best. Thank you all.
Thanks, Angus.
James.
Congratulations from all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Slange. Bye-bye.
Congrats.
All right, so I'll stop the recording here and